but I guess, can we get started?
Yes, we'll start it soon. Thank you, Michelle. I'm Erna. We're going to be a moderator today for your session. And glad that you're finally joined with us now. Okay, and shall we start, yeah, Mas? Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Also, good afternoon, Michelle in Sydney. It's also 4 o'clock p.m. at this moment, right?
5 p.m., but yes.
5. Okay. Yes, good afternoon. And as scheduled, we're going to have an academic writing workshop for today. This is going to be the second session. The first session was in the morning with Professor Zhang. And today we're going to have with you. And before we start, I would like to also give some introduction to you that the participants for today's session is the fellowship from Fellowship on Freedom and Religion and Belief from University of Gajah Mada. Can you, am I audible to you?
Sorry?
Am I audible to you?
Yes, I can hear you. Right.
Okay.
On.
Okay, so the participants for today's session are from the Fellowship on Freedom of Religion and Belief, University of Gajah Mada, Yogyakarta. And we also have some of the presenters for the conference. And we also have researchers from the University of Jember. So here, join with us in the room. Now it's more or less around 20 or more people, and we also have some more people join with us via Zoom, around 30 people. So you are going to have a 20-minute presentation. But before that, I'm going to introduce you first to the audience. Professor Michelle Ford is the director of the Sydney Southeast Asia Center. Her research focuses on Southeast Asia labor movements, the intersection between national and international trade unions, labor migration, and labor's engagement in the political sphere. Michelle's, if I may call you that, Michelle's work has been supported by a number of Australian Research Council or ARC grants related to this and other topics. She currently leads on ARC Discovery Project on Myanmar's garment industry and an IRC linkage project on trade union responses to gender-based violence in Cambodia's construction industry. In addition, she has been involved in extensive consultancy work for the ILO, the International Labour Movement, and the Australian government. So, Michelle, the floor is yours, 20 to 30 minutes from now, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Apologies again for the delay. I have been in the meeting as well. It was just that the organisers had given me the wrong Zoom link. But we're here now. I'm not going to speak for 20 minutes. I'll speak for a bit shorter because I think it's important for you to have time for question and answers if you've got questions for me. Just a minute. I just need to get the right video open. Okay. There we go. Okay, so I understand that in Indonesia, but also in many other parts of Southeast Asia, getting published in international journals is increasingly important. And sometimes this can be quite daunting, can be quite challenging if you've not done it before and it's the first time you're talking about it. Now, I hear that this morning you talked a lot about academic writing. We can talk about that a bit as well, but I wanted to take a step back and think more about the strategy of publication that will help you get published in international journals. So the first question is really about what to publish. And as we all know, different disciplines value different things. So you might be in a discipline that values books, or you might be in a discipline that values articles, or you might be in a discipline that values both. If you are in a discipline that values books, you have to be very careful that you don't use up the contents of your book in articles too much, because if you do it too much, publishers will not want to publish the book if they're international publishers with a good reputation. However, you can reuse some material that you've published in journal articles in books. You cannot go the other way. You can't use material from books in journal articles. Journals will be very angry if they find out. Editors will be very angry if they find out that you're doing that. So when you're thinking about what to publish, it's important to plan ahead. And that goes right back to the research. It's really important that you plan your research with your publications in mind, whether they be books or articles. And if you've just finished your PhD, you should be very carefully thinking about what material in the PhD should go into the book, if you're writing one, and which is suitable for articles. My second big tip here is to plan for a suite of articles or a group of articles. So when you start planning for a research project, if you think about what different parts of that project lend themselves to different articles. And one challenge, especially for beginning researchers, is when you want to put everything you know in the one article, and that's not a good strategy. It's important to divide it up and to think carefully about what theoretical frames work for different articles and what parts of a project can speak to different theoretical frames. And in some cases, you can use the same empirical data using different theoretical frames, especially if your data is qualitative. Okay, then there's the question of where to publish. In Indonesia, I know you all care about Scopus and nothing else, but Scopus is not the only consideration. You need to be publishing where people will read your work. So the first thing to do is to think about discipline. For some people, this is obvious, but for example, if you specialize in a country, if you're what we call an area studies scholar, this can be more challenging. And for people who do focus more in a country and work across disciplines, you might want to choose one discipline that you start building a profile in as a primary discipline. Then you need to think about possible journals. And to do this, it's good to start by identifying journals that publish work that you have cited, because that means that they are likely to be interested in your topic. And if you read these and other journals in your discipline, look also for something that suits your style and approach. There's no point pitching a quantitative article to a journal that publishes qualitative work. Similarly, there's no point in pitching your qualitative work to a journal that publishes mostly quantitative studies. So this is really important. You can waste a lot of time putting things in and having them rejected. And it's not a nice feeling either, of course. Now, the other thing is, if you do this before you start writing, then you can tailor your writing to the journal rather than trying to fit it into the journal post facto. So it's much more helpful to start with an understanding of which journal you want to pitch it at before you start writing. Then there are other measures of quality. As I mentioned, of course, in Indonesia, Scopus matters more than anything else. But if you're trying to generate an international profile, you might also want to try to think about what journals are considered to be good internationally, because Scopus includes some journals that are good, and it includes some journals that are very bad. So Scopus is not actually a measure of quality, it's just a measure of what the Indonesian government thinks is important. And if you're from a different country and you're thinking about this, you might want to think about what your government, what your system thinks is important, but then also about what the international audience thinks is important. So, you know, SkyMadjo, all those sorts of ranking systems are helpful. And if you're using SkyMadjo, it's good to start with journals in the top quarter, the top 25%. But be careful. In the old days, I know in Indonesia, but many other Southeast Asian countries, even in Australia, the number of publications was considered to be very important. Around the world now, it's much more about quality than quantity, and if you publish in the wrong venues, it can actually be a negative thing. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is what happens if someone invites you to contribute to a special edition or an edited volume. And for junior scholars, this can be very a big thrill, right? You can feel really honoured and appreciated if you get asked to contribute. But the answer shouldn't always be yes. You need to think about whether it's a good opportunity for you and whether you can deliver on what they want, but also will that topic actually contribute to your research narrative? And what I mean about research narrative is the story that you tell about yourself as a researcher. So, for example, often for a special issue or an edited volume, the editors will ask you to write about something that you know something about but is not your core area of research. Sometimes this is a really good opportunity, and sometimes it's actually a negative thing. You should actually say no because it takes you away from your core work and that core sense of who you are as a researcher. You also want to think about who else is involved. If you are the most senior person in the collection, you might do it because it helps other people. But if you're a more junior researcher, it is better to be in a volume or special edition that involves more senior people than if you are the most senior person in the group, because it is more likely to be read, to be cited if there are senior people in the edition. Are the editors experienced? I'm sure, Hanif and others, you've had this experience where you've contributed to a book or a special edition and it's never come to light. It doesn't actually end up being published because the editors are not experienced. Are they targeting a good quality journal or publisher? And if it's a journal, do they have a guaranteed slot or are they only pitching to the journal? Because if they're only pitching, then it's a risk. And again, you have to weigh up whether that's a good risk to take or a not so good. And if it's a book, do they already have the contract or have they published before with that publisher, which means that they're more likely to get a contract for that book. Then you also need to think about what makes a good contributor. Reputation is really important in academic work and you can lose your reputation very quickly. So it's very important to be a good contributor to if you're in a collaborative project, whether it be a special edition or collaborative research. So in terms of writing, the ideal contributor is one who does high quality work, who writes what they've been asked to write. Sometimes even very senior people put in all this work and write something that has nothing to do with what they've been asked to write. And this is difficult because it wastes time, it creates awkwardness for the editor, and ultimately it jeopardizes the chance of publication. The ideal contributor also does theoretically nuanced work. So even if the piece is primarily empirical, it's important for scholarship that it's not just like a consultancy report, it is actually academic writing. They also check for flow, language, etc. before submitting, and I know you talked about this a lot this morning. The ideal contributor also makes life easy for the editors by respecting deadlines, and this is challenging because we all tend to overestimate how much work we can get done, but it's very bad if you are consistently late with your contributions. You'll get a bad reputation, people won't want to have you on board. It's a real problem if you don't do that. You also need to communicate effectively. So if something does become a problem, you actually alert the editors to it as soon as possible, and you don't keep promising to do something by tomorrow or next week if it's simply not going to happen. And most importantly, a good contributor sees feedback as an opportunity, not a threat. If people are taking the time to read your drafts, to comment on it, they're trying to help you. And you need to respect the time and effort they put into it and use that to improve your work. Collaboration is another big issue, and I know that a lot of people in Southeast Asia have a lot of experience of collaboration, and some of it is good and some of it is not so good. So when is it a good idea to collaborate? Collaboration makes sense when someone is working on a similar topic to you from a similar perspective. But it can also be useful for you if someone's working on a similar topic but from a different perspective. This can bring a different nuance to your work and maybe spread your intellectual wings, help you learn new things in the process of the collaboration. It also makes sense when you bring different skills or bodies of knowledge to the table. So, for example, if a quant person and a qualitative person collaborate, or an ethnographer with someone who does different kind, maybe sociological interviews, a legal scholar with an ethnographer, all these different combinations mean that you can look more fully at a problem and write about it more knowledgeably. Collaboration also provides an opportunity for you to learn from expert scholars and writers. So if you might be quite experienced in your own country, but you're trying to publish in a different kind of journal, in a higher profile international journal, sometimes teaming up with a more experienced scholar or writer can be a good strategy. But in that case, you have to be prepared to do some other things for them. They might expect that you do more of the grunt work, the basic work, and that can be okay. You have to decide whether it's okay or not in each different case. But the main thing to remember is that collaboration can be a great learning experience and it can be a lot of fun. I love collaboration. I do a lot of it. But it's also hard work, and it also means that you are reliant on your collaborator. And most importantly, it's a big responsibility. When you write on your own, the only person who suffers if you don't do your work well is you. If you're collaborating, it has a negative effect on other people, and that's not a good thing. Okay. What's a bad collaborator? Normally, I would ask people to actually have a chat about this, but because you're a hybrid format, maybe not so much. So you could pop your ideas in chat. Have you ever collaborated on a research and writing project that went well or badly? And if it went badly, what kinds of behaviours made it bad? What made it bad? And then also thinking about what consequences there are for that and what strengths and weaknesses you think you bring to collaboration. So have a think yourself. If you are in the big room in Jember, maybe chat to your neighbour. Otherwise, feel free either way to pop some things. If you're online in Zoom, you can pop some things into the chat. I'll just give you 3 or 4 minutes to think about that and to respond to it.
Silakan Bapak Ibu untuk coba merespon pertanyaannya Michelle Ford yang di slide ini dengan kemampuan.
Okay, it'd be nice to see some things in the chat from people who have reflected on these questions.
There is no feedback from the chat box. Maybe we can share with some of the audience here, Michelle?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
Yep. Just maybe 1 or 2 people.
Okay, there will be one, but Rosa would like to share her experience.
Thank you.
Hi, Michelle. Good afternoon. I'm Sari from University of Jember. I wrote one article. Can you hear me, Michelle?
Yes, I can hear. Yep.
Yeah. I wrote one article about interfaith thing in Aceh, about Christianity. How can they how can they pray in while in that area, in one part of the area they don't have a church. So for me it's really interesting, but then it's very hard to publish because I don't want to make kind of like my respondent become a victim for my interview.
Can I interrupt though?
Yeah.
At the moment, I was wanting responses on the questions that I have on the screen rather than
Okay.
about publishing more generally. Would you
Okay.
have some
Yeah.
reflections on the questions on the screen?
Yeah, for collaboration, yes, because sometime when we collect that research, but for me, for example, we already collect it, but other people they don't collect it, so we have to wait long time until it can become a book, because we have to wait. So
Yeah.
and also unpleasant behavior. For example, when we have to when we have already deadline, but then other people very hurry. They want to make it published very soon, so they have to they contact often. While it's really unpleasant feeling when we have that that kind of contact. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's a great example. And what it suggests, which is really important, is that before you start collaborating, you need to actually settle the ground rules, how you're going to communicate, what the expectations are around publication, what responsibility looks like. So my big advice here is very much to talk through the way things are going to work before you start. It's very easy to think, oh, we like each other, it's going to go well, there's not going to be any problems, when in fact often, even if you like people, you can have very different ways of working and different ways of responding to pressure and so on. That was a great example. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll move on, and if other people have, we've got some things in the chat, differences in how to collect data and analyse, research results, gaps in habits of doing research together, yes. They don't do their part well, yes, that's a problem, isn't it? Sometimes people don't put in the effort into their part and they just expect you to fix it. Someone not being open to other ideas, that can also be very challenging. The other question about quality and quantity, we'll talk about at the end, yeah? I'll just got a few more slides first. Okay, so some other important things to remember. Now, some of these you will have covered in this morning, but I just want to emphasize them. The main thing is do not submit substandard work. Okay, what do I mean by that? Make sure the work that you submit is as good as it can be and that you're not wasting the time of the editors, of the reviewers and so on, but also your own time and your own reputation. Because every time you submit something that's not very good, and we all do it to greater or lesser extent, but every time you submit something that's not good, you're risking your reputation. And even though it's blind peer review, the editor knows and the peer reviewers may well guess. So it's better to do less and do it well than to rush things through. So how can you not submit substandard work? Here are some points I think are important, and maybe you have some we can add later that will add to this list. First, make sure the journal you are targeting is a good fit for your work. I mentioned this before. It's very important. Even an excellent piece of writing is not a good piece of writing if it's been sent to the wrong journal. It's not a good piece of writing for them. Presenting at seminars and getting feedback from trusted readers before submitting a piece. So once you've drafted something, if there's a seminar at your university or even nationally, if you have a mentor or some colleagues who are happy to read your work and give you critical feedback. You don't want someone saying, oh, this is great. You want someone who says, hey, this is interesting, but what about these issues? And even now, and it doesn't have to be someone more senior from you. Today, I sent a chapter for a book that I wrote to my postdoc, and I asked her for comments, and so she's written comments back for me on my piece. because it's not about seniority, it's not about status, it's about having fresh eyes that are not the eyes of the writer, and that can really help. If you are a junior writer, you may also want to ask someone more senior to just check that it's in good shape. But of course, you can't keep doing that all the time. Each time you do that, you need to learn from it so that next time the work that you produce is better. My third point is make sure that you do have a solid theoretically informed argument. Even if you're not trying to make a new theory, even if you're just applying a theory, it should still be theoretically informed, even if the work is empirical. Otherwise, it's not really academic work, and you certainly won't get published in a good journal, a good international journal. You need to make sure that your evidence supports the argument you make. There's no point having a great theoretical frame and then evidence that doesn't relate to it. And sometimes I know it's tempting to do the research first and then find the theoretical frame, but that's not a good strategy. You should start reading the literature and really understand what you're doing before you put the piece together. Another key point, and having reviewed many articles written by scholars from the region, please take notice of this, make sure you engage properly with the literature. Sometimes people, and I'm pointing my finger at some Indonesian authors here, pretend that other scholars haven't already written on something, or they misrepresent their work. And I think it's because people are scared that their work's not adding enough. But your work adds enough when it adds to the conversation, not when it pretends that the conversation is not happening. And this is also dangerous because if some of the scholars that you ignore or you misrepresent or you plagiarize are the reviewers, then that's a very good way not to get work published. So I'm sorry if I'm a bit blunt about this, but it is a really, really big problem in much of the work that comes out of Indonesia. And it's a problem that's easily fixed. You fix it by doing the work. Then there are some things that are a bit more about academic writing that you would have talked about this morning. The first is to make sure that your introduction makes the reader want to read the work, that the article flows logically and that your conclusion doesn't just summarise your data, it actually value adds. I hate writing conclusions. I'm always a bit bored by the time I get to my conclusions. My conclusions are never very good, but I'm aware of that. And if you can write good conclusions and good introductions, that's half the battle, because you want people to start it well and you want them to finish thinking that you have really made some good points. Make sure your academic writing is as good as it can be. And if you're a non-native speaker, this can be very challenging. It's also very challenging for many native speakers. My best advice is when you read, don't just read for content, read for expression and style. Don't just take people's phrasing, because that's plagiarism, but start to work out what looks like good, what you think looks like good academic writing, and read a lot of it, because the more you read of it, the more inherently it will be in your head and it will come out when you try to write. You might also want to write in stages. No one writes a first draft perfectly, but even before that, maybe start with the dot points, structure the argument first, work out what you need to say, and then if that's clear, it actually makes the academic writing easier than if you've still got that all messy in your head. Okay, so that's from me, and we can move on to some other questions if you like. So I'll start with the one that's in the chat from before.
Yes, there is a question from Ankita. Yeah.
Yes, and Ankita wants to know about the quality versus quantity. You want to do your PhD and you want to know about, yes, publications are good to have before you, if you're looking to enroll in a PhD. In some universities, they'll give you some extra points if you have publications, but only if they're good publications. So don't do too many, but try to get a couple of good ones, or one good one even, will help you get into a PhD in, say, Australia. That makes a difference. At the University of Sydney, that makes a difference. Then if you just got, but also sometimes work in a related field can also make a difference, right? So when you're applying for a PhD, if it's overseas, make sure you read very carefully what that university thinks is important. because there may be other parts of your CV that you can highlight also that help you get a scholarship or get into a program.
Thank you, Michelle, for the answers. I would like to invite some participants from the audience here offline in chamber or via Zoom. If you would like to ask questions, please use the chat box, or you can also hit the raise hand button so that I will give the floor to you. And for those of you who participated here online, could you, oh, there is a question? Do you like to ask a question, Pak? Oh, okay, no. Oh, my mistake, sorry.
Dan kalau pertanyaan bahasa Indonesia juga boleh.
Oke, misal kan speak bahasa Indonesia, jadi pakai bahasa Indonesia juga boleh. Maybe if I'm, oh yeah, there's another. I would like to ask questions, but please participants first.
Thank you, Ibu Michelle. My name is Subandri Simbolon. Where is my face? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Hello, Ibu. My name is Subandri Simbolon, Ibu. I come from West Borneo, Kalimantan. So my subject in my college is about multicultural, but the core study in my campus is Catholic religious education. One of our problem now is about the issue of collaboration. How we collaborate between different studies towards to capture a phenomena on Catholic teaching, for example. But the problem is towards that to take different subject to read the phenomena. You know, different subject is different way, different methodology, but you said that the research now is about collaboration. Do you have any tips or strategy or maybe example? I believe you have it. Please share with us.
No, that's a great question. Thank you very much. Not everything has to be collaborative, but collaborative research is definitely a bit of a trend at the moment. And working across disciplines is challenging but rewarding. But it's really important first to make sure that your potential collaborators across disciplines actually want to be involved in a cross-disciplinary collaboration. So before, one of the questions was about the group member who's very close to new ideas. Obviously, that sort of person will not be good for a collaboration across disciplinary boundaries. But once you've found someone, even if you're both really keen, it takes a lot of extra work to do multidisciplinary collaboration. The centre I run, the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, is a multidisciplinary initiative, and our core mission is to try to help people to work across disciplinary boundaries. And there's no recipe. It's really hard. But the best, you need to spend a lot of time to really understand what the problem is, to learn each other's vocabulary and to speak in ways that are not full of jargon, and to really try to find the meeting points where your two disciplines can actually value add to each other. Because for some topics, multidisciplinarity doesn't value add. But where it value adds, you have to spend a lot of time doing the groundwork. So it's all the normal work you have to do to establish a collaboration, and then a lot of extra work to start speaking each other's languages. And the great thing about it is you actually learn to see things from a different disciplinary perspective, and then you take that with you. That then enriches your work moving forward. So it is a big investment, but it can be a really good investment, not only in that particular project, but in your own intellectual journey.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, for the answer. Do you want some more feedback? Okay.
So from this was that presentation, do you prefer collaborate with same subject to write journal or what? in
It depends on the topic. For some topics, collaboration across disciplinary boundaries is better, and for others, collaboration with someone else in your discipline is better. So, for example, I published a book last year on labour and politics in Indonesia, and my collaborator was a political scientist. I come from an industrial relations background. That was a very good collaboration. I'm doing this project on gender-based violence in the Cambodian construction industry. There, my collaborator is my postdoc, and she is a Cambodia specialist, but she comes from development studies. So she's learning about labour, I'm learning about Cambodia, and she also brings in, she's done a lot of work with women in marginal communities, so she also gets a lot of insight from that. So we're learning from each other. That's what you want, right? Yeah. You want a situation where both people is value adds. Otherwise, it's hard to sustain the momentum of that extra work. So just to reiterate, my direct response to your question is that it depends on the topic, whether cross-disciplinary or single-disciplinary work is more appropriate. But for many big problems in the world now, multidisciplinary work is more appropriate because you can't understand big, complex problems just from one disciplinary lens.
Yeah. May I?
I think we should move on, yes?
Someone else might have questions in chat box. Okay. Do you mind to read it, or I can read it also for you, Michelle?
I can read it.
Great, thanks.
So talking about publications is like talking about something awesome, but not all publications can be understood by people who don't come from the same subject as yours. Okay, now this is really important, right? How do you write in a way that communicates to non-specialists? There are lots of hints here. One is just to use clear sentences. So sentences are best when they are clear and in an active voice. So subject, verb, object. And also, even if you're writing for your own field, try to use as less jargon as possible, right? Sometimes jargon is important because it helps you to understand particular things, but if it's not necessary, don't use it just for the sake of it. The other thing is to complement your formal publications, your academic publications, with non-academic publications. And of course, people in Indonesia and elsewhere in the region are very good at this. Writing for the newspaper, writing for a semi-academic blog, a magazine. And that way you can get your main points across to a much broader audience. And if they're interested enough, they might come back to your academic work. So I think it's both communicating as clearly as possible in all your writing, and then also targeting different audiences. And again, depending on what your work is, you may be able to write for journals in different disciplines. So for example, myself, I've written in geography journals, anthropology journals, area studies journals, labour journals, politics journals, and the list goes on, geography journals. And each time I have to learn the vocabulary of that community. And then I can use the vocabulary of that community to communicate with that community. And that way you greatly increase the audience for your work.
Okay, are there any more questions? Yeah, Mas Hanif, please.
Good afternoon, Michelle. When you decided to publish your last book in Cornell, if I'm not mistaken, what is your main consideration to choose that kind of book publisher? Because in international level, we have so many book publishers.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Hanif. The first thing is to look at what publishers are valued in your field and read by the people that you want to read the book. So my last book was actually Cambridge. The book before was Cornell. The Cornell book was on labour migration and union responses to labour migration. So Cornell has an imprint called ILR Press that's specialist about labour. So Cornell's a very reputable publisher in politics, in area studies, including on Southeast Asia, but it's also got this series on labour. So for me, that was a really good fit. For the Cambridge book, it was funny. My co-author and I had a debate about what publisher. She just was going to go with Routledge, which is fine. But I said, well, why don't we pitch it to Cambridge and see what happens? And then if we don't, we can go somewhere else. So, because Cambridge is a very highly prestigious publisher in our fields, we got into a really good series called Contentious Politics, so it worked out really well. And in fact, we pitched it to the Asian Studies editor first, and they weren't interested, which was funny because it was all about Indonesia. So we pitched it to another Cambridge editor, which was Contentious Politics, which has much higher profile and more prestige than the area studies list. And they said yes. So I think my message is work out which publishers are the most important in your disciplines and go as high as you can first and then go down the list. And this takes time. But generally, if your book really isn't of interest, you can get a desk reject quite quickly. And that's a good thing because it allows you to move on. What you don't want is a publisher sitting on your manuscript for 1 year and then telling you they're not interested. So I think it's also about being polite, but, you know, in those early days, just trying to get them to have a look at it reasonably quickly so they can come to a decision about whether it's right for them. But, you know, it really depends. Yeah. To be honest, most publishers use the same set of reviewers, right? So it's more about whether the editor thinks your book's a good fit than if the reviewers think it's a good fit. Because if you send it to Cambridge or Cornell or Routledge, even Palgrave, which is a much lower prestige publisher, you'll probably get the same reviewers. So then it's just about what that reviewer thinks is the requirement for that publisher. But ultimately, if the editor likes it, chances are they'll end up publishing it because they don't want to waste their time sending it out for review and so on if they don't think it's a serious possibility. That was a great question, and it's really for people who want to do books. And in Indonesia, you know, you have to think about whether the system likes books or whether it would prefer you to go into Scopus articles. If you need a book for your professorship, does it matter if it's a wonderful publication series or not? You need to make those decisions because it's a balancing act. But every time you go for a lesser publisher, you're reducing your opportunities internationally for fellowships, for visiting professorships, all that sort of thing. So if you can manage to compete truly at the international level, then you have a lot more opportunities open to you.
Yeah, there is a questions here in the audience and also one in the chat box, I guess.
Okay, thank you so much for the time. Good afternoon, Missiles. My name is Ari Wiryadinata from Indonesia. I'm one of the fellowships researcher from the CS program. I just wondering about your arguments because you just already talking about the writing for book chapters or books and journals. And now one of the docents published by one of the professor in National University of Singapore say that, Prof, no one read you. It means that trying to attract the scholars, professors to put some effort or some their manuscript to the publication like the opinion editorial. So what do you think about the futures of writing for the opinion editorials? Because some of the policymakers didn't read your journals, didn't read your books actually. They just already read some of opinions made by the Jakarta Post, for example, in Indonesia for the foreign affair policies, or Strike Time, New York, and so on and so forth. So how you see that
Yep, I've got the message.
Yeah.
It's a really good question. If you are only writing for the Jakarta Post or Tempo or whatever, you're not an academic. To be an academic, you need to be publishing academic work. But what you can do, and it's a bit like the answer I gave the woman who asked me the first question, is it's really good if you can speak to different audiences. So you write your core academic work, and that gives you the legitimacy, right, to speak. That recognition in the scholarly community gives you the legitimacy as an academic, and we speak as academics when we speak in the public forum. But then, yes, as I said before, I think it's fantastic and really important and increasingly important to then turn that academic work to communicate it to different audiences, and then you write it for the paper, or you produce a policy brief, or you network with policymakers and, explain to them what they do. So, for example, in my work, a lot of people in the international labour movement want to hear what I think. Tomorrow night in Indonesia, Friedrich Ebert Stiftel wants me to talk to them about Indonesian labour. So that way I can engage with the stakeholders, and they may not all be policymakers, but the stakeholders in your area. The Taiwanese government got me to come and talk about industrial relations in Southeast Asia. Why did they do that? They did that because I have a strong academic reputation, but also I do try to make my work accessible. And some policy makers do read books. My first book, which was my PhD, rewritten as a book. Once a senior policymaker in Jakarta, who'd been working on a civil society law, came up to me and said, this was pegangan when they were thinking about some of the issues. So some policymakers will read the books or the articles if you've communicated clearly and they're interested, but they get to know about them through your public communications. So I don't think it's either or, it needs to combine both measures.
There is a question in chat box from Mr. Maufur. How important it is for scholars abroad to have our articles indexed in Scopus journals? Is Scopus one of their prime concerns in publishing their articles? Thank you.
Not really. It's much more of the mum in Indonesia than internationally. As I said before, some things that are listed in Scopus are not very good quality. Other things are. You should think about impact factors, and you should think about what your discipline thinks about different journals. And some disciplines, for example, the Australian Political Science Association, has its own list of what it considers top journals and other journals. Different disciplines have these, not all disciplines, but some disciplines have. And they're worth looking at to get a sense of what, or if you have colleagues or former supervisors or collaborators in other countries, ask them what they think the best journals in your field are. It's actually quite hard to get that information because impact factor doesn't tell everything, right? It just says how much something gets cited, and that depends a lot on discipline. So you need to get a sense of what's considered important in your discipline. I've got another one, how to make academic writing interesting, not look like a report. Depends on the discipline. Some disciplines make you make it like a report. But in many disciplines, you've got quite a bit of room to be more creative and to be more interesting in the way that you present your work. A lot of it is about that sentence level writing, but also really, if you have an interesting theoretical argument, that makes it interesting. Or, for example, in the example I gave before, policymakers were interested in my work because they don't really know much about the Indonesian labour movement, even if they are in Indonesia. So, having new work, having something that people don't know about, that's a good strategy. And then presenting it in a way where there's a strong narrative, there's a story through it as well as an argument. That's, I think, what makes it interesting. Are we out of time now?
Yeah, I think we already passed out the time because it's already 3 minutes past 2. If there's one more questions, maybe, but I don't see any hand at this moment. So, Michelle, thank you very much for your tricks, tips, and everything that you share with us, how to choose journals, how to choose publishers, as well as that we have to balance our work, not only in academic, but also to reach a broader audience via maybe newspapers or magazines or maybe anything else. Thank you so much. It is a wonderful that you can share your experience with us today.
Thanks for having me, and good luck with the rest of the program for everyone.
Yes, thank
Bye-bye.
you. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Terima kasih teman-teman. Di off-kan dulu apa? Please.
Recording stopped.
Oke, ya. Sorry. Terima kasih. Eh, terima kasih teman-teman semuanya. This is the end of the second academic writing workshop. Setelah ini kemudian akan ada trip ke Kebun Renteng, itu pusat penelitian kopi dan kakao. Silahkan volunteer, riset asisten dan juga presenter dan partisipan kalau misalnya mau ikut. Kayaknya bis sudah ada di bawah, sama high ace. Kemudian ada mobil saya juga. Silahkan kalau mau ikut. Tiket akan dibayari sama panitia, nanti kalau kopi bayar sendiri-sendiri. Mari kita turun ke bawah karena jam 4 tutup kebunnya.